In this video, we'll be doing a Pinball Tool Spotlight on whatever the heck this is. Hey, PinDude here from My Vintage Pinball. Today we're out in the workshop. We got John's Arcade up on the YouTube, and we're doing a Pinball Tool Spotlight. This time on one of these silly looking things, a desoldering pump, or also known as a solder sucker. If you've been in pinball for a while, you work on your own machines, you're going to have to desolder at some point, whether it be something as simple as a cap kit, or you had a coil lock on and fried a transistor. You need to get those components off the circuit board without destroying the circuit board. So one way to do that is with one of these $5 to $10 desoldering pumps. Your other option is to spend $300 and up on an actual desoldering gun. But me, being as cheap as I am, I get by with one of these. So in this episode, I'll show you some of the tools you need to desolder and how to use one of these pumps. So let's get started. Alright, so to get started with this desoldering using the desoldering pump, you're going to need a desoldering pump. You can get these on Amazon. They range anywhere from $5 to $10 or so, and they come with an extra tip. And when you order these, you might want to order some more of these tips because they do wear out, and it's good to have extras on hand. Basically, this is just a simple tool. You push this in, and then when you put this on top of the melted solder, you push the button and it sucks the melted solder into the tube. We'll talk more about that later. You're also going to need a soldering station, a temperature controlled soldering station. I happen to use my trusty old Tenma 21-7930 that I've had for many years. Works real good. You're also going to need, obviously, solder. I happen to be using my Radio Shack 6040 rosin core solder that I've had for who knows how many years. You also need a good set of nippers or side cutters. This is the Heiko ones. These are available on Amazon, and I've had many of these, and these are by far the best. You're also going to need a small pair of needle nose. These are also the Heiko brand that I got off of Amazon. And that's really all you need to desolder components off your pinball boards. So let's get started. Alright, so before we get started, I'll show you what's inside this thing that makes it work. Once again, pushing down loads the desoldering pump so you're ready to go, and then when you put this on the melted solder, you push the button, it sucks the solder into this tube. So to take it apart, you unscrew the end. And here you have the tip. That can be changed with a new tip. And then inside you have a spring. The spring is what collects the wet solder. As the solder gets sucked into the tool, it will stick to this spring. So basically every time I desolder, I'll take this apart and get all the solder off the spring. And also the solder that collects in the inside of the tube. And then in the inside, this piece comes out, and there's a couple O-rings in here. A couple O-rings, and that's what makes the suction. So you want to make sure you clean all this off too. And that's really all there is to it. It's very easy to clean. It works very well, and it gets the job done. Alright, so let's get a board to practice with, and we'll go over some of that. Alright, and one thing I forgot to mention there, when you load it and suck your solder in, the next step is actually to push the trigger again, and this little rod here will push most of the solder that you just sucked out of the tool, but there's still going to be a lot of residual solder that sticks to that spring and the other parts in here. That's why it's so important to keep it clean, and you know, I clean it after every use. You probably don't have to do it after every use, but I just like to keep this tool clean. It just works a lot better clean. Alright, so if you're new to desoldering or never done desoldering before, you're probably not going to want to just take your board out of your pinball machine and start desoldering on it. your best bet is to get a scrap board to practice on. In this case, I happen to have a Williams System 3 board out of my Disco Fever that had really bad battery damage to the board. But go on eBay, buy some cheap untested boards, put a post on Pinside looking for cheap untested boards. It's good to have these around, not only for practicing desoldering, but also to have some spare components laying around. You know, it's much better to do some damage to a practice board than it is to do the damage to your original board. So there's two approaches you can take to this desoldering. You can just try to desolder the component, or the other approach is to clip the component, pull the component off the board, and then desolder the solder out of the through hole. I like to use the second method of taking the component off the board and then desoldering the through hole. It just seems a little safer for me, and although it may be slightly more time consuming, it's worked real well for me, and that is the method I will use pretty much all the time. But I will try to demonstrate both methods as we go along here. So once again, I have a practice circuit board here, and I'm going to try to show you how I desolder. So let's get going. Alright, so we'll start off on the easier side here. Something you will commonly be doing, especially if you're just going through and bulletproofing your pinball machine, is replacing capacitors. Most of the older games you're going to be working on, the capacitors are quite old and you're going to want to be changing them. So we'll start with a capacitor. And I'm going to use the method that I normally use. So I'm going to take my side cutters and I'm just going to clip one leg of the capacitor. And then I'm going to flip that capacitor up, kind of straighten out the other leg. And then I'm going to find that capacitor on the bottom of my board. Alright, so it's these two pins here. I'm just going to take my soldering iron and I'm going to add a little bit of fresh solder. And that fresh solder is just going to make the solder melt a lot better and faster and easier to get the component out. So I'm going to kind of flip the board up and I'm going to take my little needle nose pliers and grab the leg of the component and then heat the solder until I can get that leg out. And here is the cap that I just took out. Now that one took a little longer. This is a ground plane thick trace. So it takes a little more heat to get that out. And the whole point and the whole reason that you need to be careful desoldering is heat is the enemy of these traces and the pads, the solder pads that go through the through hole. So you want to use the minimalist amount of heat that you can so that you don't damage the board. And that's why I like to use this method of desoldering. So now I'm going to grab the other leg of that capacitor that we just took out, and we're going to heat the pad. And then there's the other piece of that capacitor. So now we have the capacitor off the board, which was right here, but we have solder holes that are full of solder. So that's going to be the next step. All right, so let's try another. We're going to do a resistor here. So same method, I'm going to clip the component with my side cutters and then take my needle nose pliers and straighten out the legs of that component. And then I'm going to flip the board over and find the traces. And a lot of times I will take a little marker and just make 2 little marks, just so I know that I'm removing the right solder pads here. So I'm going to add a little bit of fresh solder to these pads. And then I'm going to hold the board up, take my needle nose pliers, and grab a hold of that component, heat the solder pad, and there's our component. Got that resistor out. Now we got to go to the other side and get the leg out. Just going to heat that up. And there's the leg of that solder, of that resistor. All right, so now we're going to desolder the through hole. So we're going to find our holes again, which are right here and right here. We're going to get our desoldering pump ready. And we're going to heat that pad and stick the pump on it. And now we got that hole through. I can take an old component and it goes right in and out of that hole. So we know we got that clear. So now we'll do the same thing on the other through hole. We'll set our pump, heat the solder pad, put the tool on, and we have another clear through hole. I can take this component and it goes right in and out. So pretty simple, right? But like I said, it takes a little practice. It took me a couple tries to get this pad off. I haven't done this in a little while, so I need to practice myself. All right, so now let's try the other method. The other method being we're just going to desolder the component instead of trying to pull it off the board first. So we're going to hit another resistor here. Take the one that's next to it. Just going to make 2 little marks here. All right, so I'm first going to add a little bit of fresh solder. Make sure the desoldering pump is clear of any old solder. And then we're going to heat that up and try to suck it out. And try to show here is the old solder that we sucked out of that hole. So we got quite a lot of solder there. But the question is the component loose? And this is where it can get a little tricky and you can risk damaging the board. And the component is not loose. So let me try one more time. All right, we may have gotten it that time. Yeah, and I was able to pull it out, but it just didn't come out super clean. I had to wiggle it a little bit. I just don't particularly like this method. If you were using a more expensive desoldering gun, yeah, I mean, that gets it out in one shot. But doing it this way, I find it much better to clip the component off and do it that way. But you can practice, you know, like I said, practice and see what method works for you. All right, so another common thing you'll be doing is replacing header pins. So there's a couple of ways to approach this. What I like to do is to pull the pin out first and then desolder the hole like we were doing before. So sometimes you can get this plastic connector off by just gently prying under and getting the plastic housing off. I've already tried on this board. And these don't want to come off. So what I'm going to do is just pull the pin out through the little plastic connector. So I'm going to go to the back side of the board and find that header pin. And I'm just going to add a little bit of solder to these just to clean up that solder with some fresh solder. And then I'm going to hold the board up. And I'm going to get my needle nose pliers once again. And I'm going to hold on to that pin that I want to desolder. And I'm going to heat up the solder while I pull on the pin. And I'm not actually pulling on the pin. I'm just gently, once I feel it, see there, it's wiggling. And now I just got to get it out of the plastic housing, and there's our pin. So we're just going to keep going on these. So we're just going to keep going on these until we get them all out. Heat in the solder. Next one. And rinse and repeat. Alright, so once we get that last pin out, the whole housing will come off the board. So now we have all those header pins off the board. And now we just have to desolder the through holes. So what we're going to do is we did before. On the capacitors and the resistors, we're going to heat the hole. Suck the solder out, push the old solder out. Heat the pad. And we're just going to keep on going down the line. If you don't get it on the first shot, you might want to add a little solder. And then you'll usually get it on the second shot. So now that we have all those holes clear, we can flip the board over and put our new header pin in. And then we're able to resolder that. Alright, so the last thing that I want to show, and this is a little bit of the more trickier and time-consuming ones. A lot of times you'll need to change a chip socket. And you know, some of these can be upwards of 40 pins. So the way I like to approach these is actually if you gently pry under the chip socket, you can actually get the plastic off pretty easily. You know, it happened to break here, but it doesn't matter, we're not going to be reusing it. And after you get that socket off, that will reveal all the pins. So now all the pins are separate, and we can use that same method of using the soldering iron to heat up the pad, pull the pin out, and once we get all the pins out, we can desolder the through holes, and we're all ready for a new chip socket. I'm going to flip this board over. I'm just going to see how this solder is flowing and see if we need to add a little. I always find it to be a good idea to add a little fresh solder, especially on a board like this that's 40 years old. Alright, we're going to do as we did before. We're going to hold the board up, and I'm going to use my needle nose pliers to grab onto the first pin that I want to remove. And we're going to heat that solder pad while we gently pull the pin out. And these come out pretty easy. They're really small solder pads. Doesn't take much heat or time. And we're just going to go through and get these all out. Alright, so we got all those pins off, and we're now ready to desolder the through holes. I'm going to heat the pad and suck some solder. Alright, we got that last one off. Just want to clean up the area a little bit. Just want to make sure we get all the old solder off there. Alright, so now that we have all those holes clear, we're ready to put our new socket or ship strip in the holes. Solder it from the back side, plug our new chip in, and we're all set. Alright, so now that we're done desoldering for the day, we need to clean our desoldering iron. So I'm going to unscrew the end here. And you'll see there's a bunch of solder stuck to the spring. It all kind of flakes off. And then inside, if we pull this out, there's a bunch of solder and gunk stuck on the O-rings. You can see all the flakes falling on the paper towel here. There's a bunch stuck inside the tube. Just want to get all that gunk out of there. The end of the tip, there's also some solder in there. I'm going to use my blowgun. Wipe all this stuff down and get as much solder off as we can. Actually going to run a paper towel through the center. That'll knock off a lot of the solder on the inside of the spring. And then put our O-rings back in, our spring. Tighten that back down, and we're ready to desolder next time with a nice clean desoldering pump. Alright, so that'll do it for this episode of My Vintage Pinball. Hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you learned something about desoldering pumps. If you liked the video, please click like. Feel free to leave a comment. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Share the channel. And that'll do it. I'm PinDude from My Vintage Pinball. See ya.